serious, what's something creepy that has happened to you that you still occasionally think about to this day? When I was around 11 I was at softball practice, and for whatever reason the practice ended early, so I had to wait at the park for my grandpa to come and pick me up. I ended up having to wait alone for about 30 minutes because I didn't have a cell phone to call and tell my grandpa that practice ended early. I remember sitting on the swings when an adult man, in his 30s or 40s, came and sat down next to me. He asked if he knew me, and I said no, and he told me that I must just have one of those pretty faces that feel recognizable to anybody. I remember feeling happy about the compliment, and I kept talking to him. Eventually, he told me that he had his car with him, and that he could drive me home to my grandparents' house so that they didn't have to worry about picking me up, and I wouldn't have to wait any longer. Being 11, I didn't think anything of this and proceeded to get into this stranger's car. Luckily, my grandpa showed up just in time and I remember seeing his car and jumping out to meet him. The stranger sped off without talking to my grandpa, and that was the last I ever heard about it. This is such a vivid memory for me, and I often find myself thinking about what would have happened to me and what a different person I would be today if my grandpa hadn't shown up when he did. It's tucked up that no adult from your softball team waited with you for your grandfather to arrive and instead left you there all by yourself. Smoking a blunt with the ducker who had raped and murdered a friend of mine the previous evening. We were all hypothesizing what had happened, while the psycho who had done it was casually trying to plant disinformation. Cops came for him later that afternoon. Edit: I was somewhat incorrect on the timeline. Cops talked to him later that day, but he wasn't arrested for a few more. Suicide trigger warning: this happened when I was 7. I was walking downtown with my dad who was buying a CD. We used to go to the record store and he'd chat music with the workers and I'd play on the Sega Dreamcast. I remember there was a guy watching me play and it looked like he was crying. He was just kind of staring at me, but because I was 7 and had vidaya, I didn't think much of it. About 20 minutes later there was a bunch of people gathering outside, so we went out to see what the commotion was about. The guy who was crying was now on top of the roof standing on the ledge. He screamed, "This is for you, Daniel," my name, and jumped. My dad put his entire body over mine to prevent me from seeing it, but the guy who jumped died. I thought about it every day for over 20 years. Skip ahead to about 5 years ago. I'm now at a Christmas staff party, drinking heavily with my team. A guy on said team and I have heart-to-hearts about our pasts, and he tells me that he is bisexual. However, he hasn't been with a man in 20 years. He used to date a man behind his girlfriend's back who committed suicide when he wouldn't leave her. Coworker's name is Daniel. He was in the crowd with me. Two strangers forever changed together, but 20 years in the past. This may not be creepy to some, but it haunted me for most of my life. Pretty sure I almost got kidnapped when I was a kid. I was 10 years old walking home from school and an elderly couple driving by stopped and asked me for directions. They were looking for the street I was walking towards, so I pointed them in that direction. Even though my directions were very clear, both were acting confused and asked if I can get in the car and guide them there and then they would drive me home. I told them it was fine. My house was right here. I lied. They were pressuring, guilting me a lot, and being too nice about wanting to drive me home. It gave me a really weird feeling in my stomach, so I pretended to walk towards a house that wasn't mine, and they drove off. Smart kid. When I was 10 years old I lived in the middle of rural Alabama. We had some odd neighbors. Being curious kids, my friend and I followed my neighbor and his son and daughter one day when they left their house and walked into the woods. I was very familiar with the area because it was back when kids could roam free until the street lights came on. Anyway, we trailed them for about 2 miles through the woods, across an old cemetery, and down a railroad. They stopped at a clearing beside the tracks and my friend and I hid opposite of them and watched. They started digging and kept pulling up bones and putting them in a bucket. We got scared and bolted. I immediately told my parents, but they didn't believe me. I'm 32 and remember that day clearly. Edit: I forgot to come back to this. Had some major life changes lately. I didn't expect this to get such a response. Thank you all. After reading the comments, I would like to add, this happened in very rural Talladega County around 1999. The neighbor dad wasn't someone you'd expect to have a high school diploma at first glance. I remember him not being too kind to his kids sometimes. After thinking more about that time, weirdest of all that hit me, there was never a mom. Again, that's just my 10-year-old's memory. When I was in 3rd grade, I was home alone with my quadriplegic grandma from after school until my mom came home. One day the phone rings, and I answer it, and an unfamiliar man's voice says, "Hey Justin, a Morabite. Did you just get home from school?" I say yeah. "Who is this?" Instead of answering me, he started asking things like, "Do you ever touch yourself? Do you like to look at girls?" Being in 3rd grade, of course I was like nope, and hung up pretty quick. I told my parents but nothing ever came of it. I still wonder to this day who it was, how they knew my name, and my whereabouts. This was back on a corded landline with no caller ID either. I had a similar thing happen to me when I was around the same age, but I was with my whole family. This guy was at least high school age and my dad got so mad he took the phone and threatened the guy. Never heard from him again. I think it was a neighbor down the street. Still like, WTF. When I was about 13, myself and a friend were walking to a middle school dance. I lived right across the street from the school. From my house there was about a 50-mile sidewalk to it from the main road. Anyways, as we're standing at the traffic light, waiting for our turn, I noticed a man in a van and a person in another car yelling at each other. I'm 100% sure I saw the man in the van wave a gun at the person. So he pulls up to the light and is waiting. He calls to me and my friend. Says he needs directions. Who TF ask 13-year-olds for directions? I pull my friend's arm and tell her we need to leave. We start walking back towards my house away from the guy, and he got out, left the van right there at the light. My friend and I take off, full tilt, make it halfway down the path, before ducking into some side bushes. We're sitting there with our hands pressed over our mouths while trying to be as still and small as possible. I'm trembling and can hear my heart pounding in my ear. The man stands at the end of the walkway staring down towards my house. Luckily there's quite a few houses along the block, so it would have been impossible to tell which one we ducked into. Clear as day. In his hand at his hip is a gun. He finally leaves and my friend and I run back to my house to call my mom and the cops. I refuse to walk to school after that. We had something similar happen. A friend and I were breaking glass bottles at the boat ramp near my house. This guy pulls up and we hid in the bushes. We were 11-yo. And this guy tells us to come out because I'm a police officer. He kept yelling for us to come out. The bushes were really thick and short, like a tunnel, and he couldn't get to us. I have seen his truck there before, and I'm 80% sure he wouldn't have abducted us. But you never know. A self-defense instructor once told me that if you get into a car, your chances of surviving an attack go down by 75%. I used to spend a lot of time walking through the woods fields by my mum's house, and noticed a path one day that I hadn't seen before. I was listening to music following down this path as the trees around became more dense. You could tell it wasn't often people walked down there anymore. I remember it being more of mud gravel trail. At this point I was deep in the woods. Hadn't seen another person for a long time, and shaded by the leaves of the trees. I don't know what made me notice at first, but I think I smelled the smoke. I stopped on the path, and maybe 5 meters away to my left in the trees was a small fire that had obviously been stamped out in a hurry, still burning embers and smoke, so it had been done only a few moments before. Cue me realizing there wasn't anyone around that I'd seen, and that whoever had stamped out the fire was hiding in the trees somewhere. I have never felt a gut feeling to run like I did in that moment. Straight back the way I came, and did not look behind me until I was back into the main woodland with people around. We'll never know if I was paranoid and it was nothing, or if I avoided something bad that day. Haha. I grew up in a decently rural area about 40 minutes outside a city. One of my neighbors had to call the cops once because someone was back on their property late at night and had started a fire. Cops show up and arrest a man who had murdered his GF and was trying to burn the body. Dumb bus pulled off the road thinking he was in the middle of nowhere and was actually only like 50 from the back porch of one house and in view of multiple. But yeah, when I would jog by that stretch of road, I'd run a little faster. I had a stalker in college. Had to move dorm rooms and building 4 times in the middle of the night. Friends would help me get to my dorm by pretending we were going to theirs and making sure no one was around when I'd go into mine. He found 2 of the dorms and left notes in my room. It's been over 11 years and I live in a completely different state, but every once in a while I get the feeling I'm being watched and panic. I briefly had a stalker in college as well. I met him on Tinder and went on one really bad date where he told me he had in fact lied about his name and age, and I got freaked out and ended the date. A couple days later I left my apartment where he picked me up because of some unrelated rumored problems and was living in my car before the university gave me a dorm room. Then a couple days after that I get a call from one of the aforementioned roommates saying a guy dropped something off for me at 8 AM. This dude lived in central New Jersey and I went to college in New York City. He made the trip out to give me a well-used hard copy of an album I had mentioned liking. Apparently his favorite album from his personal collection. A drawing of us. He gave me disproportionate anum titties. It looked like a 13-year-old boy's idea of a sexy woman, and wrote a long letter, the gist of which was, "If I can't have you, no one can." Thankfully I wasn't in that apartment anymore. But after class that day I saw him waiting outside my car in the university parking lot, the car where I lived. I noped out of there really quickly and told the school, which is why they gave me the room to begin with. He kept texting me and I kept blocking him. He must have made 15 new social media accounts before he got the idea. I'm still scared of ever going to Central Jersey because I'm scared I'll run into him and he'll follow me home. When I was maybe 10 I was over at a friend's house hanging out. Her neighbor was out of town and my friend was feeding the cat while they were gone. So my friend and I went over to feed the cat. Immediately upon opening the door, we heard someone walking upstairs. They were loud, heavy, slow footsteps like didn't even sound human. My friend and I just looked at each other and sprinted back to her house. The worst part was we told her mom and the mom didn't believe us and made us go back and finish feeding the cat alone. We were terrified but did it. When the neighbor came back, they found that their house had been broken into. I've never gotten any before. As for my friend's mom's reaction, we were in upper end suburbs in the early 2000s at the time. I think people thought these were incredibly safe with no crime, not the magnets for robbery they often were. It also probably totally sounded like we thought it was a monster ghost. At that age we didn't really understand what it was. But definitely in the future, when my kids are scared, even if it's a monster, I will know better to listen to them. Did her mom ever apologize? No. Just brushed it off and was like, "Oh well, isn't that weird?" No. Sharon. It was freaking scary. My mum used to start at work at like 3 AM and she was up at about 2:30 having her coffee. I heard her up and went to see her. She joked that she heard something outside and me being a bit silly opened the blinds up wide as a joke and there was a guy just standing there staring into the lounge room. That was creepy enough as it is. But what sticks with me is the fact he didn't run or really react for what felt an eternity. While I ran to get my old man and brother, apparently he just stood there and then slowly walked off. I was followed home once. I was 23 at the time. I'm female and I lived a 5-minute walk to a busy bar area. I noticed him following me and I went to a full out run to get into my building. The guy also ran, but luckily by the time he got to the entrance to my building the glass sliding door had shut, automatic buzz door. The absolutely terrifying part was that as I stood there behind the glass catching my breath, he just stood there staring at me. Didn't walk away or anything. What in the heck was he planning to do if he caught me? Still gives me the shakes 5 years later. Someone broke into my house while I was home alone when I was 19. I found them hiding behind this 7-foot tall toolbox my dad had in the basement. I was about 5 feet away and saw their hands. I told them I was going to let them leave out the back door, but I was calling the cops. I locked the basement door and ran upstairs. Watched them run down the street with their shirt pulled up over their head. About a month later we got back from a trip out of town, and we had been robbed. I can't imagine it wasn't the same person. When I was 13 I was in a bookstore and a grown-ass man approached me in the manga section and started asking me about my love life, if I had a girlfriend, etc. I left and watched the escalator from outside to make sure I wasn't followed. Next thing I know he's standing next to me and asks me to help him move a couch into his van. I kindly say duck no, and he jogs across the street and out of sight. I go inside and tell an adult who responds, yeah, they've been getting complaints like that. When I was little I was sleeping over at my friend's house. I woke up in the middle of the night to use the bathroom dark far end of the hallway, away from her room. When I stepped out of the bathroom, her older brother was standing outside the door, in the dark. He never said a word, just walked up to me silently and put his hands around my neck. Someone stirred and he dropped his hands. I immediately called my mom and left without even saying anything. Friend never believed me, and I never went back. I was 18 when I had my first long-term girlfriend. We ended dating on off for 4 years. When we first started fooling around she kind of clammed up and I backed off. On the car ride home she explained that her last BF was very forceful and that it would take her a while to open up. I of course was understanding and offered comfort and was willing to wait. Things seemed fine for a while, but whenever we'd have trouble he'd kind of creep back into the picture. Usually through IMOld and AOL Messenger. He'd talk to her and then message me threatening me and telling me he was going to get her back. This went on our entire relationship. One time she called me hysterically because he'd shown up at her house and grabbed her, kissed her. He was always a huge strain on our relationship until about the 4-year mark when she called me up really upset and asked if I would come over. She said she had made a big mistake. I was pretty sure she cheated on me and I'd read it was with this guy. When I get to her house she explains that this old boyfriend was her the entire time. I was catfished by my girlfriend for 4 ducking years. Constantly harassed and threatened in my weakest moments nonetheless. It's been 20 years since then and it still messes me up when I think back. This happened around 2008. One day I heard the voice of a young Indian man about 20 years old saying hello, hello, while I was using my laptop. I had always kept the camera taped over, used virus software, periodically checked the download folders, etc. But when that happened I freaked out that I'd been hacked and went through every possible safety check again, down to seeing which programs were currently running, whether the neighbors were accessing my Wi-Fi, was it one of those loud pup virus ads, and if my camera or microphone permissions had been turned on. Couldn't find a thing. It happened 2 different times in the year after that. Same man's voice. 2. I no longer use that laptop, and I still keep any laptop cameras covered, because God knows how that person got a hold of my computer X. When I was around 14 I was home alone, upstairs, when I heard somebody busting open the kitchen door yelling fire, fire, get out. I didn't smell anything, nor did I think that there was that could ignite a fire. I had ordered takeout and all the things that could set a fire were off. So I decided not to get out and called 911 explaining everything. The police came and found muddy footprint in the kitchen, along with the kitchen door busted.